Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone had a really good bank holiday weekend. My name's Matthew Baird, and this is the Social Housing Roundtable. To anyone who's new to it, it seemed like we've got some familiar faces and some new ones as well. So great to have you all with us. This whole thing is funded by Baird & Co Recruitment in partnership with District 4. So I've been doing social housing recruitment now for 11 and a bit years. I've actually recruited some of the people in the room as well, which is great. And I love it. It was a sector I fell into. I knew nothing about housing when I first started recruiting for it, and now run sessions like this every single week. For anyone who's new to the roundtable, all of the recordings are available on YouTube, but I also run these every Tuesday, 11 till 12, and it's a different topic every week. And we ran 48 of them last year, so it gives you a rough idea of the breadth of conversation that we're having. Jan actually came to me, I think it was via LinkedIn, you probably picked up on these, or maybe via mutual connection, Jan, in terms of seeing the roundtable, and then reached out and said, have you done one recently on fire safety, or have you done one at all on fire safety? At which point I was like, no, somehow that's been an oversight. And so I was really grateful that you kind of A, were to bring this to the chat today, and B, were able to kind of bring on a few years experience, should we say, into the sector, to where your journey's been. So I'm going to be sharing the presentation as well as letting people in. So I might not be the quickest on the chat whilst we're doing the presentation, but I will do my best. If anyone has questions or wants to come in at any time, please use the reactions tab, raise your hand gesture, and I will absolutely bring you into the conversation. But without further ado, Jan, I'll pass over to you to do introductions and let me know when you're ready for me to start the presentation.
Okay, well, if you want to stick this first slide up then, Matt, that'd be great. So some people I can see will know me, others will wonder who that strange person is. So I've been in housing, public housing. I hate the word social. I've been in public housing since 1968, which is a bit scary. As a chief officer towards the late 80s in London with the London Council, and retired in 1999. So I've been retired in the private sector for nearly 24 years, which is also a bit scary. I'm here this morning. I'm vice chair of the London and South East group of the National Social Housing Vice Strategy Group, which is a catchy little title. But their website is firesafetyinhousing.org, which is worth you having a look at, because if you're working for a social landlord, you may want just to see whether somebody in the fire safety team has already registered as a member of the group itself. So this morning, some of the stuff I'm going to say is likely to be old hat for some people, but for others it may be new. So please forgive me, because I wasn't quite sure who was going to be attending this morning. So a lot of people are worried about the fact that a lot of housing managers, middle and junior housing managers, are concerned about being asked to talk about fire safety to residents, and I don't think you should be. I think fire safety as a personal thing is as basic as road safety. We all know that you don't go off wandering across the motorway or across a busy road without taking precautions. From a professional perspective, safeguarding, we're all aware of the warning signs to be looking out with regard to a safeguarding issue, and I think fire safety is exactly the same. And I think if you've managed to keep yourself safe from fire at home, then that information should be shared with people you're actually working with. So from a practical perspective, I think professional curiosity is vital. Housing managers should be confident enough to say to a surveyor or a fire engineer, "Are you sure? I'd like to know more about that." And have the ability to ask those questions and to ask sensible questions. They may even appear to you to be stupid questions, but ask them anyway, because that's the way you learn. So the background to fire safety, for us anyway, is the Regulatory Reform Order 2005, implemented on the 1st of October 2006. And for many people, it passed them by. It wasn't until the Lakanal House fire that people got very, very excited about the fact they hadn't done what they should have done. That was laid the basis for the Fire Safety Act, which came in 2021, and the Fire Safety Regulations 2022, all bits of legislation that from a housing management perspective you should be aware of. I'm happy to share further information about it if you want it, but that's the basic building blocks of information around fire safety, and the regulations of 2022 laid down some specific things, some of which have come out of the Grenfell inquiry phase 1. Next slide, please, Matt, if you're able to. That would be fabulous. So some basics again. Lakanal House was the block in Southwark that had the fire in July 2009. Sadly, 6 people died. But it wasn't until January 2013 that the inquest was held, and it was held in Lambeth, not in Southwark. So if you're looking for Lakanal House on the website, all the details you'll get will be on a Lambeth website. And as a result of that inquest, which took nearly 12 weeks, the coroner issued what were called Rule 43 letters. The coroner has the ability to say to people, look, I think you need to be doing something to stop this sort of death happening again in the future. And that coroner took the unusual route of issuing 4 letters to the council, to the Fire Sector Federation, to the government, and to the London Fire Brigade. And whilst a lot of attention is paid on the lessons to be learnt from Grenfell, I would argue, and I've argued continuously since 2014, that the lessons from Lakanal House should be learnt from. And if you're working for a social housing landlord, you should be aware, if you as an organisation have had, you should be aware if you have actually got an action plan based on the Lakanal House recommendations. Next slide, please, Matt. Because although the fire took place in 2009 and the recommendations from the coroner came out in 2013, when you look at these, you think, if you go back, you've gone too fast, Matt, go back a bit. The letters to Southwark highlighted things that came out during the Grenfell inquiry. She talked about making sure signage in high-rise residential buildings could be understood by all, and by all that included the fire brigade, as well as people who didn't have English as a first language. She talked about policies and procedures concerning fire risk assessment needed to be reassessed. She said that the staff involved in maintenance and refurbishment work needed to have training about fire safety. And that comes back to my point about everybody being aware, being aware of fire safety. Access for emergency vehicles was an issue at Grenfell. The simple fact of keeping a space available for a fire tender to reach the base of the dry riser is vital to the safety of the block. And retro-sprinkling of sprinklers was mentioned, and that's been an ongoing issue around fire suppression generally. And I'll come back to that later this morning if we have time. Next slide, please, Matt. But those letters that came out from the coroner in Southwark looked at these other ones. There was a fire in Harrow Court in Stevenage in February 2005 when there were 3 deaths. And some of those deaths related to the fact that the fire officer, there was I think at least one fire officer died because the wiring to cabling within the block got wrapped around the firefighter because they'd been attached to the ceiling with plastic clips. And that coroner said, well, actually, that's quite a bad idea. You need to do something about it. But nobody did. And in April 2010, 2 firefighters died from exactly the same thing. And that, in the end, prompted a change in electrical regulations so that cables that are fitted to ceilings now have to be fitted with metal clips. And there's the ongoing issue about hoarding. Back in the day, housing managers used to throw their hands up in horror and say, there's nothing we can do. It's a lifestyle choice. We can't do anything about it. But the coroner for the Derby hoarder in January 2012 actually said, I think you do need to do something about it because it's not just a lifestyle choice. It's an issue around the building in which the hoarder lives, but they are a threat and a danger to their neighbours. And in a house in Derby, a lady died. And it took the fire service 3 days to recover the body. Now, fortunately, I think all social housing managers are taking hoarding much more seriously, but it remains an issue that has to be dealt with on a regular basis. Next slide, please, Matt. So the Grenfell Grenfell reported from phase 1, and they made a series of recommendations which are, as I said, part of the new regulations, some of which are still being haven't been implemented. But there are some basic housing management things that I think are worthy of just reminding people about. If you've got a tower block, where is the gas main valve to the entire block? In Grenfell, it was in the basement, and they didn't get into it until the day after the fire had started. And when they went in and turned the gas off, the fire went out. If you're going to evacuate any block, whether it's a sheltered block, a small block, a big block, have you got a plan in your organisation that says where are these people going to go if there's an emergency? Never mind a fire, lifts pack up, no water, no electricity. Have you got a plan that says we know where the nearest safe location is for residents of that block to go to? The other issue is about accessing computer information. Kensington and Chelsea weren't very good at that, and they didn't have access. So if your out of hours team are dealing with repairs, have they got access to the main computer system that everybody else looks at during the course of the day? Absolutely vital information. And escalating out of hours emergencies. The chief executive of the TMO didn't find out about the fire until a board member woke him up by phoning him and saying, have you seen the telly? Now, there should be a process in any organisation that escalates something that looks like it's getting, that is big, to go up the line. And if you haven't got that process for your out of hours process existing at the moment, I would urge you that now would be a good time to do it. The electric mains of the blocks, there were some issues about whether or not electric surges had caused a problem. It was decided by the inquiry that it wasn't. But I would say that if you've got a block that has got mains electricity, that the wiring hasn't been changed for possibly 50 or 60 years, somebody should be making sure that the wiring is safe and is not going to cause a problem, because that would be a major issue for you if it did. Next slide, please, Matt. So what do we know now? From a fire safety perspective, the BRE did some research, and I should be giving you links to these at the end of today, and I'm happy to take questions or emails or anybody from in the future. And I'll go back again. So BRE did some research into the Scottish deaths, and Home Office have just issued some research which came out at the beginning of March, which show something that would confirm that we know that most fires start in the kitchen, most deaths occur in the living room or the bedroom. Older people, like me, are more likely to die in a fire. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Well, it doesn't make sense, but it's a fact, isn't it? That if you're on your own like me and you're over a certain age and you may have trouble moving around, you're going to die because you can't get away from the seat of the fire. And interestingly, the Home Office research, and I'll share the slide with you in a minute, most deaths do not occur in high-rise flats. They occur in bungalows or in houses. And from a housing management perspective, sorry, that should be off. So from a housing management perspective, the challenge with the demographic is that over 65s are forecast to increase by 3 million over the next 10 years, which means that even if everybody else is doing the right thing, there's going to be more of people of my age than of the majority of people who are watching this morning. And as we're more likely to die in a fire than you lot, that will increase. That's likely to increase the number of deaths in a fire unless we do something about it. So the irony would be that we'll have the Building Safety Act in place, and despite the Building Safety Act, the number of deaths per year may actually increase. Next slide, please, Matt. And here's the stats from the Home Office research that has come out quite recently. So the male fatality rate is nearly 6 per million. Women, for reasons which are beyond me, are slightly safer at 3.6 per million. That's the general population. Get to my age, between 65 and 79, and the rate of dying doubles. And as you can see, get to over 80, it doubles again. So the whole issue about the population getting older is it has the potential for being a serious challenge for fire safety generally. Next slide, please. So these are the stats. They're in the document, but you'll see for the deaths, this is in the Home Office. This is from the Home Office research. From 2011 to 2019, the deaths in high-rise flats, and those figures include Grenfell Tower. the proportion of deaths in high rise is very, very, very small. Bungalow, single occupancy down the sheet, a lot higher. And it's logical, isn't it, that bungalows are usually occupied by people of my age, not your age. And if we can't get around quickly, we can't get away from the fire. That explains for the death. And then low-rise flats and houses, that's where the majority of deaths actually occur. It's an interesting chart, that, and is worthy of further consideration. And I'll commend the link to you. The Home Office research is about 100 pages, but the words that accompany it actually run to about 35. It's worth having a look. And the link, Dave, is going to be on the last slide. Patience, my man, patience. So next slide, please, then. So, Matt. So the challenge with deaths is because the number of deaths has been going down, their numbers. And I just thought, I've been doing some research into coroner's reports since Lakanal. So they're now called Prevention of Future Death Reports. It comes under Regulation 28 of the coroner's rules. And since 2013, there have been 39 instances where a coroner has issued a report to somebody to say, this person died, and I think we should be doing something to prevent this kind of death happening again. And I'm just using a couple of examples because I think it's worth doing. So in 2014, an 88-year-old lady died after dropping a lit cigarette onto a sofa. Unable to move it, the family had provided for a pendant for her to press, but they didn't realize it could be connected to an alarm. So the pendant wasn't linked to a smoke alarm, and she died. In April 2015, a 72-year-old died in a fire, discarded cigarette. The bedding had caught fire. He was killed by smoke inhalation. There were no smoke or heat detectors. There were smoke and heat detectors in the kitchen, but nothing in the bedroom. He was known to have been at a high risk, but nobody had put detectors or done anything about it with regards to give the opportunity to raise the alarm anywhere else. Next slide, please, Matt. April 2016. Guy's bedbound. He's been cared for by his friend who lived in the house with him. Carers came in 4 times a day. His friend goes into the garden to take out the rubbish. He quickly lights up, and he died. And he died because emollient residue, one of a major cause of death with older people who have been having lotions rubbed into them to keep them safe in bed, actually has the exact opposite. So the message for a social housing provider, I would suggest, is that if you've got people who are bedbound or even just in wheelchairs, there needs to be some warning about the fact that this stuff is deadly whilst it's attempting to keep people well within their bed. And a recent one which interested me, and I'm still pursuing with the coroner some of the issues around it, but an elderly guy was identified as having a risk due to his smoking, and he was immobile. There were smoke alarms in the house, but they weren't connected to any kind of monitoring system. But the fire started in the electric motor of the bed. Smoke alarms were activated. Fire brigade weren't contacted until people saw smoke coming out the window. 10 minutes after the first alarm went off, he got burnt and he died. The coroner has been pursuing a number of people with regard to how did the fire start in the first place. And this one's quite personal for me, and I don't want to kind of go into a personal stuff, but let me explain why I'm interested in this. There are lots and lots of people living at home on electric beds that have been provided by the National Health Service. When Mrs. T, my wife, had a major stroke in August 2019, she came out of hospital in November 2019, and I was her 24/7 carer while she was on the bed. Sadly, she died earlier this year. But I'd done everything I thought I could do to keep everything safe at home. But this one just worried me because the manufacturer of the motor apparently said that the motor was being serviced in accordance with their instructions. My concern, which I haven't got an answer to yet, is that it is possible, I would argue, that a bed that's in a hospital should possibly have a different servicing arrangement than a bed that's in somebody's front room, where clearly it's not a sterile area and may well be an issue. Now, London Fire Brigade haven't been able to find any other fires from this sort of thing, but it's something I'm going to keep an eye on and pursue. And generally, these specific cases are not being provided to depress you, but just to highlight the personal nature of these deaths. And I've been doing some research into all of these coroner's reports. I'm going to be speaking at the FireX exhibition with Andy Frankham from the national group next week. And we've got September the 1st booked for a session with the London Fire Brigade in London to talk about the details of this and what we should be doing about it. Because I would argue that this isn't just about alarms. The ability is available to actually put these fires out where they are present in some shape or form. And we should be doing something about that. Next slide, please, Matt. So those of you who've got tall blocks and are busy putting together their resident engagement strategies for those individual blocks, I just thought perhaps a reminder of some basics are worth highlighting. So I'd call them some please do's. People should be testing their own alarms regularly or having a system to have those alarms tested regularly. Obviously, if you're always burning the toaster, things are going off on a regular basis anyway, so you know that. Residents should be reminded that the front door needs to close properly. You're obviously going to be testing that as a landlord anyway, but it's worth reminding people that they've got their own responsibility to do that. It's also remembering that some children under 10 can't hear the noise of a smoke alarm. Research, if you Google it, that was done by ACO in Scotland and has been done in Australia and in America shows that surprisingly boys are more likely not to be listening for an alarm than girls, but it's a fact that families need to be reminded of, I think, as a matter of course. And the emollient creams that I mentioned before are deadly, and the effects can be horrible. So next slide, please. So that's some please do's and some please don'ts. They're obvious, but don't smoke in bed. Don't leave cooking unattended. That's sometimes difficult to do. Don't charge stuff up. Leaving it unattended or overnight, bikes, scooters, phones, laptops, anything. I put up on LinkedIn last year a couple that were charging their baby alarm. They were charging their baby alarm, left it on the bed obviously in the bedroom. When that shopping came back, the flat was on fire because the thing had blown up. Don't leave lit candles unattended. Again, don't tamper with the front door. Good idea not to leave your appliances running when you're not at home. The overloading of electric sockets and switching them off when not in use. As a housing manager going into somebody's flats, you just happening to look around. If there are burn marks on those sockets, it's worth referring that back to a technical person to have a check. And obviously, if you've got a balcony, it's an awfully good idea not to have a barbecue on the balcony. The campaign by the London Fire Brigade last year, when we discovered that Amazon was selling barbecues specifically made to hang on the railing of a balcony, they managed to get them to be withdrawn. So some basic stuff there, and it is all basic. This is stuff that we should be doing at home. And Dave, there's your stats. There's your references. I'll be able to produce more if they're needed. Thanks, Dave. We'll be able to produce more, but that top one, the Home Office one, I think is really interesting and is worthy of having a look. The Scottish BRE stuff, there's two reports. They did an initial one, then a final one with lots of recommendations, and all of that actually refers back to the need for suppressants. So those of you who follow me on LinkedIn will know that I'm working as an advisor for a company called Plumis, who make a very clever piece of kit. This is a water mist that comes from an electronic nozzle in the wall and is activated by the smoke alarm. And for some of those deaths that I've mentioned before, it's my view, and remember, I'm not a fire expert. It's my view that they may well have been saved, and if that piece of kit was in their home, and of course this piece of kit can be installed on a flat by flat basis. And a reminder, I'm not a fire safety expert. I just happen to be a housing manager who thinks it's a good idea to have residents who can stay alive for the duration and die naturally. I am a chartered member of the Institute. I'm also an associate of the Institute of Fire Safety Managers, which they've allowed me in purely because of my involvement in fire safety since Lakanal House. Because the reality is that prior to Lakanal, as a senior housing manager in London, fire safety had never come up on my agendas in any shape or form. If there was a fire in a tower block, the fire brigade turned up, put the fire out, and went away again. Obviously, that's no longer the case, but it just shows that the way things have changed in my lifetime as a housing manager.
And a couple of things that have come in, I guess, Jan, in terms of the chat, because I think this is a really good point, as when we were discussing it before, to open it up, and a really, really interesting kind of discussion you've got there. And thank you so much for the presentation. I think there's some really interesting things there, particularly I think when we look at the stigma around, oh, it's always high-rise flats and that kind of stuff. And actually, when you start to see some of the statistics, it's very different. I want to start, just before I ask one of the questions, obviously the main thing today, the topic today, was kind of fire safety. Are we doing enough? Do you feel that social housing providers then are doing enough, aren't doing enough, just need to reinforce the basics, or kind of need to focus the entire training and mindset?
I think there is a danger, and it's an understandable danger, that we're concentrating on building safety, because that's the 250-page piece of legislation that we have to do something about. And there are lots of people in rooms with towels wrapped around their heads doing all sorts of stuff that in many cases should have been done years ago, but they're doing it. But the reality is that a landlord can get their assessment certificate saying the building is safe, and the week later somebody dies on the 15th floor of that block because of something relating to fire safety, not building safety. So the building safety bit is important because the fire will be retained within the compartment, which is the way the thing should have happened in the first place. But because of something that's happened at home that shouldn't have happened, somebody is going to die. And my point about the statistics are that unless we keep fire safety on the agenda in the same way as we keep gas safety on the agenda, back to age again, because there's going to be more of me knocking about than you lot, the number of deaths is likely to increase by virtue of people's inability to move away from a fire. So if there is a piece of kit available that says, actually, by doing clever stuff, stop the fire in the first place, by stop the fire occurring, by doing the basics, and having something available to suppress the fire if the worst happens, I think it's a combination of those two. So what I'm saying is that social landlords need to obviously comply with the law with regard to building safety, but have to maintain the issue around fire safety, because it's fire safety that is, in my view, is the issue, and was the issue going back to Lakanal and before.
Thank you. Dave, I'm going to bring you in. Thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you. Jan, that was fantastic, and thank you for your time. I guess it was rather terrifying in some aspects, but that's what it needs to be for folk to realise the importance of this. Obviously, I'm Scottish, and obviously in Scotland we have these interlinked devices and alarms. Do you know, or does anyone know when, because a lot of my customers are in England, funnily enough, of when a similar law will be in England? Are they even thinking about that, Jan?
It's interesting because my accountant is Scottish as well, and I had that discussion with him early last week, and I'm actually in the process of checking it, because I know that the law in England for smoke alarms generally changed on the 1st of October.
Right.
So what happened was, as a result of some Rule 43 letters, which I hadn't mentioned, that had been issued by a coroner in Sussex, she had banged on about the fact that people in private sector properties were dying in fires where there were no smoke alarms. The law changed in England in 2015, where it was where private sector landlords were obliged to provide smoke alarms for their residents. And it was decided at the time there was no need to do anything about that, because social landlords were really nice and they looked after their residents. The reality was that, in fact, that needed to be brought into the public sector as well. And so 1st of October last year, the law changed for landlords, and in many landlords across the country, they are rushing around trying to make sure that those alarms are, whether they have to be interlinked or not, I can't for the life of me remember. But what I will do, Dave, I will check it out, and I'll get a way back of getting back for people on this.
I think it makes a big difference, Jan.
No, absolutely.
Can I just take another minute, please, to give an example of I worked and one of the issues I face is that you mentioned about the chief executive was notified via somebody in staff, looking at the news, and I think the governance of all of this is incredibly important. I worked with a not to be named, but you could probably work it out if you checked, London Borough over the last 3 years, where we did a lot of work on the systems side of things and fire doors especially. And we found this is a brutal example of how lax the sector can be, but how we need to learn this lesson. The fire doors were fitted in a certain apartment block. One fire door didn't fit particularly well and was squeaking, so they phoned up and a contractor came and replaced it with a less squeaky non-fire door. I mean, we may laugh about that, but imagine the news of that, and that was found out. And I think we've probably all got examples of that to some degree. We need to get more serious about the governance of these things and how these types of things are controlled. So that's my 10 pence worth. And I think somebody else has got their hands up, Sally.
No, thank you, Dave, and thank you for your input there. It is exactly that. I think it's that constant re-education piece, because we do it a lot in school, and then, like so many things, you never kind of get educated again as you go through adulthood. Sally, over to you. Great to have you with us. Nice to see you again. Oh, I can't hear you. That was just me.
Sounds like a loose microphone.
Yeah, maybe. See whether that's. Try again. No.
No.
Can't hear you, Sally. While Sally's sorting out, Jan, there was a question which came up into the chat before, which said, why aren't landlords obliged to furnish this information with relevant authorities and agencies?
Give that question again.
I think it was when you bring on, it was the middle of your presentation. It said, why aren't landlords obliged to furnish this information with relevant authorities and agencies? So I guess where's the obligation on, why isn't there a more central obligation or to
Well, to be fair, that the Building Safety Act has actually amended the RRO, and in fact, landlords are now obliged. Well, we'll be obliged from the 1st of October to provide that information to their residents, particularly of tall blocks. The problem is, of course, is how much information do you give people? I'm doing a piece of work for London Borough at the minute. I've been reading some really good fire safety booklets that have been produced by landlords, but they're 70 pages long. Now, a 70-page booklet is thick enough to actually hold a fire door open probably for 30 minutes. And whilst it's of interest, I suspect, to perhaps relatives of somebody living in a property, with the best will in the world, unless you're fascinated by the subject, you ain't going to read it. It's hard enough to find the time to read that document that came through your front door if you had an election in your area last week, and that was probably only 2 pages. So it's about, and we're in a world, aren't we, where sound bites are the key. So I think landlords who are producing newsletters and should be producing newsletters to the residents on a regular basis, and continue to remind people about the gas checks to be done on an annual basis, that's the place where that information needs to be continually pushed out. And I've made the point in other places that I think every time there's a meeting with residents, fire safety should be on the agenda. Every time there's a meeting with staff, fire safety should be on the agenda. That point about a contractor turning up and putting a piece of cardboard on somebody's front door, that training, the landlord with regards to the contractor should be making sure that those people have been undertaking training, and it's a continuous. It's the whole thing about competence is an issue that will continue to rage for months to come. But competence, lots of competence, is about common sense. But you can only it ain't very common, is it? People need to be reminded the whole of the time, I think, and I think that's kind of from a landlord perspective, that just needs to be on the agenda every time. In the old days, I go back to when I was a younger manager, we'd have health and safety on the agenda because we were interested in how many people had fallen over or had tripped over, or anybody had fallen off the top of a tower block or whatever. Fire safety has to be on every agenda on a regular basis.
So Sally's questions coming through the chat, and obviously, if anybody else wants to dive in on any of these, if you've got any experience, please do it. You know, everybody is welcome to chat at any time. So you said most new developments, especially high rise, have open plan kitchens and living rooms. I'm assuming that these pose a higher risk than separate kitchens and living rooms. Has there been any research done on this, or does anyone know if there's been any work done? Because it's a really interesting point, actually, the fact that obviously that gives it more room to spread without a fire door between the two, I'm assuming.
Well, any new properties will be built in accordance with building regulations, and they will be signed off by a building control officer. And it so happens that, I'm not plugging them, but it's a fact of life that the piece of kit that I've just mentioned has been employed in thousands of properties in an open plan setting to allow an open plan setting to be safe, so that there is a smoke detector linked to a water
Because is there
suppression
more
system.
of a risk then? You know, without that piece of kit or without some kind of tech involved, I'm assuming then having an open plan is more dangerous than having a separate.
Well, if we come back to the most fire start in the kitchen, the issue is where does the fire go after it's been in the kitchen? And it may well be that that's been preempted by the fact that the door to the combined kitchen and living room is actually a fire door into the means of escape into the property, and that might be the way that it's been done. Like I said, I'm no fire expert, but from a practical perspective, if having a piece of kit in the property that actually puts the fire out straight away, and if you Google it, you'll see it happens. It can be done very, very quickly, in my view. So, in accordance with the building regulations, it is possible to do it, and I think it's it's a question of applying common sense.
Fair enough. And like I said, I think you've just got to make sure you have something in there. As you say, the question is how easily can it spread? And let's put a part two. There's a question there from Mataza, which I'm just going to go back to. Apologies if I mispronounced your name there. I do try my best. I'm really sorry. In regards to fire alarms for the private sector, would this need to be hardwired units, or is battery operated adequate?
So they're smoke alarms. They're not fire alarms. They're smoke alarms. Mm-hmm. And my memory of the regulations is they should be hardwired. But the regulations are, you can check it online. It's very simple to do. There's also advice on the government website to double check as well. From a perspective, as long as you need to check what the law is first. I'm not going to give advice about smoke alarm, but you need to check what the law is. But there needs to be there needs to be something that tells you there is a fire.
Absolutely. So I know, actually, I mean, I rent privately, and I noticed it wasn't long ago that my carbon monoxide alarm got moved due to a change in regulation. So, but I'm lucky that I've got a landlord who stays on top of all that and told me before I even knew myself. So, Sally's second query is about fire fatality and house type statistics. Has anyone correlated these against the numbers of each house type across the country? So, by that, Sally,
I understand. So, in other words, it in terms of numbers, just how many flats are there compared to how many houses are there? I'm sure it's been done, and it may well be in the documentation of the 120 pages of the research that I haven't read. But now you've asked a question, I hate I've been asked questions I don't know the immediate answer to. So I'm actually going to go and find out, Sally. It's a really good point. The issue for me is that at the time of Grenfell, I was working with the London Borough of Ealing. The issue for me was that this hysteria about dangers of living in a tower block just frightens the pants off people who actually live in the blocks. And I think that from a landlord perspective, just trying to keep people calm about what they're reading on the telly about, all the fire doors are. It's just trying to keep ordinary people reassured, whilst not only just reassuring them, but doing the right things to reassure them, which is where the Building Safety Act comes into play with regard to specifically what we're doing. And I think from the fact that everybody now has to do their resident engagement strategies per block, that's a way of reassuring people about the reality and reassuring people about what they're actually doing about the fire. Because remember, part of the new legislation that comes into effect in October says that the landlord will have to tell the resident what the fire risk assessment found and what the landlord is doing about it. Something that is completely new and is really, really important, I think.
And I mean that could be incredibly enlightening and probably quite worrying for others as well. I'll bring Dave in just a moment. There's a point from Claire in the chat. Like you say, Jan, a lot of this is common sense, but it's not always common. My speciality is data, and I feel data safety should be talked about all the time too. But I also used to work in health and safety, and I completely agree talking about. I completely agree about talking about fire safety too. I worry though about people being overwhelmed by too much information. In an ideal world, we would be increasing people's ability to identify risks of any type, but that's easier said than done. And she believes that hardwire is required for the private sector. I actually don't know if mine are hardwired or battery. I think at the moment it's still battery, but I'll have to have a look into that. But, you know, I think it's that piece around, like you say, how often and how much information, when we talk about that overwhelming, some of the, even your please do's and please don'ts you put on, they're quite easy to just kind of ingrain and get into your mind. Too much information can then be people switch off, and I think that's the problem.
Absolutely, but remember the issue. The current issue with regard to, I mean, there are two current bits of kit knocking about: air fryers and bikes, electric bikes. So there's a piece in your neck of the woods, Matt. If you Google air fryers and the Birmingham Mail, there was a story where West Midlands Fire Service was saying they'd had a worry increase in fires caused by air fryers. I don't know the reason, but they just said there's more air fryers, therefore, and there are more fires. Number one. Number two, the more deadly one is the bikes. So the London Fire Brigade have explained that it's a major issue. They've issued information. I think all the fire services now have issued information about safety, but still people are plugging their electric bike into that socket in the hallway between their bedroom and the front door and going to sleep. And I think it's 8 deaths so far where the thing has kicked off. Their smoke alarm's gone off, and all the smoke alarm has done it essentially is woken them up to tell them they're going to die because they can't get out past the fire that's occurred in the hallway. So it's banging on and banging on and banging on about the issue. But I don't think we can overstate it. And the other thing I think the examples I gave of the individuals, I also think that when people put it together and gave strategies for resilience, physical or pictorial examples of things that have gone wrong, or even things that have gone correctly. The fire in the multi-story car park in Liverpool in 2017, where 1,500 cars were burnt on New Year's Eve. There are some remarkable photographs in the report done by Merseyside Fire and Rescue Service, which shows complete black Armageddon of where the fire took place. Yet the staircase, and it's obviously not a modern block, the staircase was protected by a very old, what we call a nominal door, and there is no smoke damage on the other side. Some visual examples to people, I think, is a way of bringing home information rather than statistics.
I completely agree. It's getting the information across in multiple ways. Dave, do come in.
Thanks again, Matt. Sorry for hogging the call.
Not at all.
First of all, I don't know about everyone else, but I'm not going to sleep tonight now unless I am everything. Jan, my mother, until she recently passed away, was in a care home for quite a while, and one of the things that you've not talked about is care homes, especially in the social housing side of things. There's a lot of care homes and people being looked after with those types of beds. And every day we used to go in, and I remember my kids used to play with the bed going up and down and all of these things. It was a great toy, much to my mum's bemusement. She had no idea what was happening. But do care homes have any regulations around looking after these motors, looking after these things in the smoke and the general sense of things?
Right. So let's park the electric motor thing for the moment.
Yeah.
I'm going to do some more research because I think it's necessary to be done. But currently,
I'd like to hear that research when you come up with it.
Well, I'm happy to. Obviously, I'll be sharing it. But essentially, currently, it was a one-off, and people have to work out how it actually happened. Care homes generally also going to be more of a sterile environment anyway, because they're going to be properly looked after. The reality is that the fire regs apply to them as well. Obviously, the point from a personal perspective is that obviously there are staff on duty the whole of the time and are trained to deal with emergencies. Within that 39 Regulation 28 reports, a couple were for care homes. There was a story in the press about 18 months ago where Bupa was fined nearly £1 million because an elderly person, a guy in a wheelchair, was outside the home. He was in a smoking area, and they had basically turned their back on him. He'd lit his fag, it had dropped into his lap, and he was covered in emollient cream, and he basically went up like a firework. Now, that kind of stuff. They were fined, all sorts of stuff has gone into it, and lots of people are running around making sure lessons are learnt. But I think the care home environment, there's a whole pressure out putting sprinklers into care homes. The people I've been talking to, the people I work with, have also put some targeted suppression system into properties, into people that are more likely to die in a fire. But I think from a risk perspective, we're talking about smoking here. We're talking about people who smoke. So from a landlord perspective, that that thing called the person-centered fire risk assessment, which should be done in order to determine how somebody can get escape from their home in the course of fire, it's really important that you identify where the smokers are in the block, because that's where. So it's not just the smokers; it's their ability to move away from the fire if they've dropped the fag and the circumstances around it. It's about assessing the risk without getting hysterical about it and being understanding what the risk is.
Sensible. Thank you. Thanks, Jan.
Sally's mentioned in the chat she's definitely going to make sure the please do's and please don'ts are included in our new home user guide, and I think that's absolutely vital. They do say they ensure that all charging areas, usually hall cupboards, have a sprinkler head in them as well as a smoke detector and fire alarm. So obviously that would help. And Victoria Moffat said, if I can share a personal example, there was a fire in a building on my estate caused by a barbecue on a balcony in which no one was hurt. Since then, there's been outrage when we've been reminded not to have barbecues on balconies. So I agree with Jan that banging on about this is really, really helpful. Claire backs your idea of visual images. And Gareth Iverson, BS 5839-6 states that all rental properties, whether private or socially rented, are to be covered by T1 LD2 systems. This is mains powered with battery backup in hallway, landing, kitchen and living room. And Stephen Schneier said smoke detectors in social housing need to be hardwired to the mains electricity supply with a battery backup. And then finally, a point there from Roy McHale, lifting equipment such as beds, hoists, passenger lifts, etc. should have a Lola inspection carried out every 6 months. I think the emphasis there maybe is on should, but that's
well, Mac, if I can interrupt, because
please do.
I mentioned my personal circumstances with Mrs. T. So the company who provided the equipment for Mrs. T did regularly inspect the kit, but I don't recall any of them getting under and looking at the electric motor. And it's something I am raising. And Victoria's point about the barbecue fire, I'm aware of, and this is another issue about discarded cigarettes from balconies. People don't realise that if they're having a fag on their balcony and they throw the thing out over the balcony, the wind effect in a tower block can suck a cigarette back in. And in fact, I'm aware of a number of occasions, and it happened whilst I was at Ealing, where the tenant of somebody on the 17th floor had a fag, threw the fag over the balcony. Tenant on the 10th floor, who'd gone to Morrison's, came back to notice smoke coming out of his flat because the cigarette had been sucked back into an open window and had hit the curtains, and the flat went up in flames. So cigarettes are pretty deadly, to be fair. Nobody should be using them at all.
I think there's definitely a piece around those, and maybe, I mean, I know you obviously talked about the a population kind of coming through. Hope there seems to be less people smoking as generationally, but as you say, when we've got a population at the moment, there's still, if we're looking at that side of the population do still smoke quite heavily. It's about not judging, but it's about putting those processes in place. And I do feel it was an interesting one that you mentioned earlier as well about how children, because I didn't know this till earlier this year, like I said, my partner's a children's nurse, about children not hearing smoke alarms. They just don't resonate, you don't hear it and everything else. So if you have got single parent families with children under those ages, then that can be a real, actually, you know, if they trip and fall and then a fire breaks out, the kids might not know what's going on until way too late.
And that point about talking to residents and having an action plan based on Lakanal, and I know it happened, well, the report came out now 10 years ago, didn't it? But I would maintain that there is merit in a landlord organisation reporting to its board on at least an annual basis to say, this is what happened in Lakanal, and this is what we've done since, and this is what we're continuing to do. And that point about telling people about what's going on, as a result of when we reviewed what was going on in this particular London borough, we issued a safety checklist, fire safety checklist for all new residents. No point giving them to the resident the minute they've got their keys, because all they want to do is get in. But that first visit back to the property to talk to the resident to make sure everything's okay, having made sure that they knew how to get out of the property, then all the basic stuff, and reminding them that their kids may not hear the smoke alarm noise. And that kind of basic check process needs to be in place all the way through for the landlord, A, to be able to demonstrate they know what they're doing, and secondly, is to be reassure themselves that residents are being told at the proper time and are being reminded at the proper time.
There's a question from Janine Hayward. Do you know if rise and recline chairs and sofas often used by people with mobility issues potentially present the same concerns as electric motor beds?
It's a really good question. I've got Mrs. T's chair in the living room, and the same thought had occurred to me a couple of weeks ago. Again, I am going to pursue it because I'm, as you can imagine, a little bit on the safety fire conscious myself. Yes, but I'm going to check it out, and we're happy to share.
I used to have a sofa which had a reclining thing, and yeah, I didn't even think about that, but it's plugged in all the time, and those things can get warm, so it's definitely worth.
Listen, if people aren't already following me on LinkedIn, can feel free to kind of give me a poke and I'll link in, because I'm always putting stuff up on LinkedIn, and I put up a summary of the new legislation last year about just putting stuff into place for people to easily understand it, and it got seen by 26,000 people. So just feel free to follow me, and my stuff will then pop up on a regular basis. Hopefully you won't get bored with it, but I try and give it a bit of an interesting twist if I can.
No, I really appreciate that. And where we've kind of got a couple of people who've had to bounce, and obviously thank you everyone who could join us today. And where we're down to kind of the last few minutes, Jan, is there anything you'd like to, I guess, final thoughts to leave people with? Because evidently, as we discussed before, there's a lot of information that can go into this, but actually some of it can be broken down really easily. And I mean, for me, from what you've said, a lot of it is just making sure those conversations are continuing to happen, and not being kind of like, right, we need to sit down and talk about fire safety again in that kind of almost patronizing way, but just going, by the way, have you seen that? That's happening, and here's pictures. Or it's that conversation that of the basics.
I think there are two things. It's about risk. It's about what the risk is, and it's the conversation around where is the risk in the building, and who are the people most at risk by virtue of their age or lifestyle. And having identified those risks, making sure that you as a landlord are able to do something about it. Because I think, you know, God forbid that somebody ends up in a coroner's court and the coroner says, well, you knew about this, why didn't you do something about it? And I think that's the kind of the professional dilemma. Talk about being awake at night. That's a major issue. But being practical about it, trying to make sure we're doing things that stop the fires occurring in the first place. And if they do occur, how can we make sure they don't go any further than the property in which they're in, and the person in the property then can remain safe? That's my message, really. And thank you for the questions and stuff today.
No, look, not a problem at all. Thank you for joining us. Thank you everyone else who came along. I hope everyone else was able to get something really interesting out of that. I certainly was. And, you know, I think it's clear that I don't feel there are any housing associations intentionally being negligent, but there are definitely more that can be done to have those conversations and to try and get, you know, just like I said, that those small things that people don't think about can easily add up to large things very, very quickly. And as we saw with Grenfell, it only takes one incident to go awry, and suddenly it's, you know, therein lays the problem. And we also just need to make sure we're not stigmatizing the fact that, oh, well, it's only social housing residents who live in tower blocks this can happen to, because it really, really isn't. Yeah,
And it
thank you.
wasn't.
No, well, absolutely. And finally, thank goodness that came out. For anyone who's interested in joining more of the roundtables, particularly if you're new, like I said, these take place every Tuesday, 11 till 12. Do reach out to me on LinkedIn. I will put a post up later today, which will have the recording link to it. And also, you know, everyone's names tagged in so people can connect with each other. Next week, I've got Darren Beattie from Trauma Informed Services coming on to talk about how social housing could benefit from a trauma-led response, particularly in, I guess, supported and some less general needs, but in some social housing providers. So that should be really interesting. And then I just realised that the week after that, we've got one on blame culture, which again should be really, really interesting. But I'll keep in touch with everybody. Do reach out, and obviously these are all supported. I don't like doing the sales plug, but they're kept free because I have been doing recruitment for 11 years. So if anyone does need any recruitment support, please reach out, because this is exactly why I left an agency, so I could set up things like this myself. Jan, thank you so much for your time today. Really, really insightful. And I look forward to seeing all of you at a future roundtable in the future. Brilliant.
Cheers.
Cheers all. Take care.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.